Inspector Blackwell arrived at the vicarage at precisely 11:47 in the morning, driving a dark saloon with the methodical speed of a man accustomed to crime scenes and official procedure. He was a compact man in his early 50s, with the bearing of someone who had spent 30 years in the police force and had developed a healthy skepticism regarding human nature. His face was unremarkable, neither handsome nor particularly distinguished, but his eyes were sharp, moving constantly, cataloging details with the efficiency of long practice. By the time he stepped out of his motor car, the news had already spread through Little Thornwick with the inexorable speed of a London fire. Word of Dorothy Sayers' death had been conveyed through telephone calls, hurried visits to neighbors, and the sort of rapid dissemination of information that could only occur in a village of fewer than 1,000 souls. By noon, nearly everyone of consequence knew that the vicar's wife had been poisoned, and nearly everyone had a theory regarding who was responsible. Mrs. Marple learned the details of these theories through the simple expedient of attending the village shops. She collected her weekly groceries, posted a letter to her great-nephew in London, and called at the chemist for a small bottle of liniment, purchases that necessitated visits to 3 separate establishments. In the process, she heard no fewer than 7 distinct hypotheses regarding the murder, each one presented with absolute conviction by someone who had either been at the garden party or had received a second-hand account from someone who had. The most popular theory, promoted primarily by Mrs. Pauline Ashford during a conversation at the grocer's, centered on Dr. Weatherby. Such a young man, Mrs. Ashford had observed, arranging her purchases with deliberate slowness to allow for maximum conversational opportunity. And clearly besotted with Henrietta Ashford, you could see it plain as day at the garden party. My husband remarked upon it. Now, suppose Dorothy Sayers had discovered some impropriety between them. The girl is engaged to Geoffrey Hammond, a respectable gentleman, if somewhat dull. Mrs. Sayers, being a woman of strict moral principles, might very well have threatened to expose the affair. Dr. Weatherby is ambitious. He came to Little Thornwick specifically to establish himself as the village physician. A scandal of that magnitude would ruin him. Motive and opportunity, Mrs. Marple. Motive and opportunity. A competing theory, advocated by Miss Honoria Finch, placed the blame on the vicar himself. The marriage was never a happy one, Miss Finch had confided, lowering her voice to a stage whisper despite the fact that they were alone in the post office. Everyone could see it, a man of his age, suddenly wed to a woman so much younger. It was never going to work, and Dorothy, from what I could gather, was rather extravagant, always spending money on improvements to the vicarage, new, furnishings, that sort of thing. A clergyman's stipend doesn't stretch as far as one might hope. Perhaps he feared she was running through his savings, or perhaps, and this is merely speculation, perhaps she had formed an attachment to someone else, and the vicar discovered it. A crime of passion, Mrs. Marple. It happens, even in the clergy. There was also considerable sympathy for the theory that young Margaret Winters had played a role in the affair. She was always rather volatile, Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell had suggested, while Mrs. Marple was selecting tea at the grocer's. Pretty enough, I suppose, but temperamental. It was common knowledge that she harbored feelings for James Corbett, the solicitor's clerk, you know. Now, suppose Mrs. Sayers had some reason to discourage the match. Perhaps she had her eye on the young man herself, or perhaps she thought Margaret unsuitable. Young women can become quite desperate when their romantic prospects are thwarted. One reads about it in the newspapers all the time. By the time Mrs. Marple returned to her cottage at 1:30 in the afternoon, she had accumulated enough speculation to fill several notebooks. What struck her most forcefully was not the theories themselves. All of them were predicated on the assumption that the murderer had acted from either romantic passion or financial desperation, but rather what they failed to address. None of the village gossips had asked the most fundamental question: what had Dorothy Sayers been poisoned with, and how had it been administered? She was contemplating this omission when Constable Murdoch arrived at her door, his uniform looking slightly rumpled, his expression somewhat anxious. He carried with him a small leather notebook, and the air of a man performing a duty he understood to be important, if somewhat beyond his competence. "Inspector Blackwell has asked me to conduct preliminary interviews with all the guests from yesterday's garden party," he explained, once Mrs. Marple had settled him in her small parlor with a cup of tea. "Just to establish a timeline and gather initial impressions, you understand. He'll be conducting more detailed interviews himself, but he's extremely busy at the vicarage at the moment, cataloguing the scene and such." "Of course, Constable," Mrs. Marple said pleasantly. "I should be happy to assist in any way I can." Murdoch consulted his notebook. "You were at the garden party yesterday afternoon, from approximately 2 o'clock until 5:30. "That is correct. I was seated beneath the refreshment tent for most of the afternoon. The sun can be rather intense at this time of year, and I find the shade preferable. Did you observe anything unusual? Anything that struck you as odd or out of place?" Mrs. Marple considered the question with apparent seriousness, though she was conscious of how much she might reveal and how much she ought to withhold. The garden party itself was well organized and proceeded much as one would expect. The only thing that struck me as somewhat unusual was Mrs. Dorothy Sayers' absence from the party for some 20-odd minutes in the late afternoon. She carried one of the large silver tea urns into the house at around 4 o'clock and did not return until shortly after 4:30. Constable Murdoch made a note of this, his eyebrows rising slightly. "Did anyone else enter or exit the house during that time that you observed?" "No, Constable. I was watching rather closely, as I do enjoy observing the patterns of social interaction. Mrs. Sayers was alone in that regard." The constable made another notation, then looked up from his notebook with evident relief. "That's quite helpful, actually. Inspector Blackwell was wondering about the timing of events. He'll be interested to hear this." As Constable Murdoch prepared to take his leave, Mrs. Marple found herself considering the curious fact that nobody, not the gossips at the shops, not the constable, not even the inspector, presumably, had yet asked the crucial question that had begun to form itself in her mind with increasing clarity. If Dorothy Sayers had been poisoned, and if she had been alone in the house for those crucial 23 minutes, then the poison must have been placed in something she had consumed before entering the house, or during her time within it. The question was no longer who had done it, but rather what had been poisoned, and when. Inspector Blackwell appeared at Mrs. Marple's cottage door at 3:30 that same afternoon, accompanied by Constable Murdoch, and carrying with him the peculiar authority that comes from having spent decades unraveling the mysteries of human wickedness. He was a man of few unnecessary words, and he dispensed with pleasantries entirely, settling himself into the armchair opposite Mrs. Marple with the air of someone whose time was too valuable for extended formalities. "Constable Murdoch tells me you observed Mrs. Sayers' movements rather closely yesterday," he began without preamble. "I understand she was absent from the garden party for approximately 23 minutes in the late afternoon." "Yes, Inspector. She carried one of the silver tea urns into the house at 4 o'clock precisely and returned at 4:23. I noted the time because I happened to consult my watch." The inspector's eyes narrowed slightly, the only visible sign of his interest. "And you observed no one else entering or exiting the house during this period?" "That is correct. I had positioned myself to observe the comings and goings of the guests, as I find such observations rather interesting from a social perspective. Mrs. Sayers was alone in that regard." "Why were you observing people's movements, Mrs. Marple?" The question was posed without accusation, merely as a factual inquiry, but it carried an undertone that suggested the inspector was assessing her motivations. "I have found, Inspector, that human behavior often reveals more than words. People are creatures of habit, you see, and when they deviate from their established patterns, it is frequently for a reason. I was simply exercising the small hobby of observation that occupies many solitary elderly women." The inspector seemed satisfied with this explanation, though his expression suggested he was mentally cataloguing her as someone more perceptive than the average village observer. When Mrs. Sayers returned from the house, did you notice anything unusual about her appearance or manner? She appeared somewhat pallid and fatigued. She touched her hand to her forehead, as though checking for a fever, and she moved more slowly than she had before entering the house. Did she consume anything after her return? Food, drink, anything? Mrs. Marple considered this carefully. I did not observe her eating anything, Inspector. However, she did not remain in my immediate line of sight for the entire period following her return. She rejoined Mrs. Pauline Ashford's conversation near the rose garden, and I was attending to my knitting at that point. It is possible she consumed something that I did not observe. The inspector made several notes in his own book, a leather-bound affair considerably more substantial than Constable Murdoch's. The doctor's preliminary examination suggests Mrs. Sayers ingested poison sometime between 3 and 5 o'clock yesterday afternoon. The exact toxin has not yet been identified, but the symptoms, the peculiar discoloration, the odor about the mouth, the apparent speed of death, all suggest cyanide or a similar compound. The autopsy will confirm this, but we shall likely know more by tomorrow morning. A remarkably swift poison, then, Mrs. Marple observed, which suggests it was administered in something she would consume immediately, rather than something requiring slow absorption. The inspector looked at her with renewed interest. You seem familiar with toxicology, Mrs. Marple. Not at all, Inspector, but simple logic suggests that if Mrs. Sayers was active and apparently well at 4 o'clock, yet died sometime between then and the early morning hours, the poison must have acted relatively quickly. And if it acted quickly, it must have been something she took into her body deliberately, believing it to be harmless. Or something placed in her food or drink without her knowledge, the inspector countered. Indeed, though that raises the question of how such a thing could be accomplished at a garden party, where the refreshments were being served by multiple people and where any tampering would be difficult without observation. The inspector closed his notebook with a soft snap. You have a logical mind, Mrs. Marple. I appreciate that in a witness. Now, I understand you knew Mrs. Dorothy Sayers reasonably well as a member of this village community. Not particularly well, Inspector. She had been resident in Little Thornwick for 5 years, and while I had encountered her at various social functions, I would not describe us as intimate acquaintances. She was a capable woman, though somewhat reserved regarding her private affairs. Did you ever observe any tension in her marriage to the vicar? Mrs. Marple chose her words with deliberate precision. I observed that the vicar and his wife came from rather different social backgrounds and possessed somewhat different temperaments. Whether this constituted tension sufficient to be termed remarkable, I should hesitate to say. Many marriages encompass such differences. But you observed something, the inspector pressed, something that suggested tension. I observed that the vicar, when speaking of his wife, occasionally left his sentences unfinished in a manner that suggested inner conflict, whether this stemmed from marital discord or merely from the natural reticence of a clergyman regarding personal matters. I could not say with certainty. The inspector stood, apparently satisfied with the interview. I shall likely have further questions as my investigation progresses, Mrs. Marple. You have been extraordinarily helpful. It is not often that I encounter witnesses whose observations are both detailed and restrained. Most people either notice nothing or embellish everything. After the inspector's departure, Mrs. Marple sat quietly in her parlor, her knitting abandoned on the side table. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to arrange themselves in her mind, though several crucial elements remained obscured. She knew that Dorothy had been poisoned, that the poison had acted quickly, and that it must have been consumed sometime between 4 and 5 o'clock yesterday afternoon. She knew that Dorothy had been alone in the house for precisely 23 minutes. What she did not yet know was what Dorothy had consumed during those crucial minutes, and whether she had done so of her own volition or through the machinations of someone else. The answer to that question, Mrs. Marple suspected, lay not in the garden party itself, but in the events that had preceded it, in the months and years of hidden resentments and secret passions that festered beneath the surface of village respectability. She picked up her knitting once more and settled into her chair as the afternoon light began its slow descent toward evening. Tomorrow would bring new revelations, new interviews, and new opportunities to observe the subtle behaviors of those who might possess both motive and opportunity for murder. Mrs. Marple was quite prepared to wait for the truth to emerge, one small observation at a time. The autopsy results arrived by telephone at the police station in Ashford Cross at 9:30 the following morning, and within an hour, Inspector Blackwell had established a makeshift headquarters in the vicarage's study, which had been cordoned off from the rest of the house as a temporary office. The confirmation of cyanide poisoning, while not entirely surprising, added a layer of deliberation to the crime. Cyanide was not something one acquired by accident or impulse. It required access, planning, and a coldly calculated intention to cause death. By mid-morning on Thursday, the village was in a state of barely suppressed panic. The murderer, everyone agreed, was almost certainly someone within their own community, and that realization that one of their neighbors, perhaps someone they saw at church or passed on the street, was capable of administering poison with such precision, had transformed Little Thornwick from a place of comfortable security into something far more sinister. Mrs. Marple learned the details of the autopsy report not from official channels, but from the predictable medium of village gossip. Miss Honoria Finch, who had a cousin who worked as a secretary at the hospital in Ashford Cross, had received a telephone call that conveyed the essential facts with remarkable speed. By the time Mrs. Marple encountered Miss Finch at the butcher's shop, the information had already been distributed to at least a dozen other residents. "Cyanide, they say," Miss Finch whispered, selecting a joint of lamb with unusual intensity. "The most terrible poison. It works almost instantaneously, you know. One would think there would have been warning signs, convulsions perhaps, or screaming. But apparently cyanide can sometimes kill so quickly that the victim scarcely has time to realize what has occurred. A most dreadful way to die," Mrs. Marple agreed, observing Miss Finch's evident distress with sympathy, "though it does suggest a degree of intention and knowledge on the part of the murderer. One does not administer cyanide without understanding its effects." "Which makes it all the more terrifying," Miss Finch replied. "It means we are dealing not with some crime of passion, but with cold, calculated murder. Someone in this village, someone we know, someone we perhaps consider a friend, deliberately planned and executed the death of another human being." The butcher, Mr. Harrowgate, who was wrapping Mrs. Marple's order with practiced efficiency, added his own observations. "The inspector has been questioning everyone who was at the garden party. My wife tells me he spent a full hour with Dr. Weatherby yesterday afternoon, and he visited Geoffrey Hammond at his London office this morning, drove there himself, apparently, to conduct the interview in person." "Geoffrey Hammond?" Miss Finch looked startled. Whatever for, the man wasn't even present at the garden party. "Precisely why the inspector wanted to speak with him," Mr. Harrowgate said with the satisfaction of someone who had uncovered a logical inconsistency. If Mrs. Sayers had discovered something about his fiancée, about her involvement with Dr. Weatherby, for instance, she might have threatened to inform him. Perhaps he came to Little Thornwick that night, confronted his fiancée or Mrs. Sayers herself, and in the heat of passion. But how would he have obtained cyanide? Mrs. Marple interjected quietly. And more importantly, how would he have managed to administer it without anyone observing? The garden party was attended by nearly 200 people. To poison someone in such circumstances would require either extraordinary luck or extraordinary planning. The butcher and Miss Finch exchanged glances, both seeming to realize that Mrs. Marple had identified a crucial flaw in their theorizing. The truth was that the most obvious suspects, Dr. Weatherby, Geoffrey Hammond, the vicar himself, all faced the same fundamental difficulty. The garden party had been a public event, conducted in full daylight with numerous witnesses. Whatever poison Dorothy had consumed, it must have been administered in a manner that would not attract attention or suspicion. That evening, as Mrs. Marple sat in her parlor, listening to the wireless and working on her knitting, she found her mind returning repeatedly to that crucial gap of 23 minutes. Dorothy had entered the house at 4 o'clock, carrying a silver tea urn. She had returned at 4:23, appearing fatigued and unwell. The obvious conclusion was that Dorothy had consumed something during those minutes. But what and where? The silver urn itself seemed to be a detail of significance. Why would Dorothy personally carry an urn into the house? The vicar's housekeeper, Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard, had been present at the garden party and had been managing the refreshment tent. Surely she would have been better suited to the task of fetching additional supplies. Mrs. Marple made a mental note to inquire, at the earliest opportunity, regarding the contents and purpose of that particular urn. She had a suspicion, still nebulous and unformed, but nonetheless persistent, that the key to understanding Dorothy's death lay not in dramatic confrontation, but in the mundane details of household management. The following morning brought a development that seemed to confirm the growing suspicion that the investigation was becoming increasingly complex. Inspector Blackwell arrived at the vicarage with a warrant to search the premises, and by mid-afternoon, word had spread that the police had discovered a small bottle containing traces of cyanide concealed in the study, a room that belonged to the vicar himself. The arrest of Reverend Thomas Sayers took place at 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon, conducted with the discretion that befitted a man of his station, but nonetheless creating an uproar of shock and disbelief throughout Little Thornwick. Within hours, the village had divided itself into those who believed the vicar guilty and those who maintained his innocence despite the damning physical evidence. Yet Mrs. Marple, sitting quietly in her cottage as the news circulated, found herself thinking of that moment at the garden party when the vicar had made his unfinished remark about his wife being, perhaps, too capable sometimes. She thought of Dorothy's pallid face upon her return from the house, and she thought of the silver urn that had occasioned her absence. And she began, very carefully, to consider the possibility that the inspector had made a significant error in his reasoning. The arrest of Reverend Sayers created a peculiar vacuum in the village's social fabric. The vicar, who had presided over weddings, funerals, and Sunday services for nearly 20 years, was now confined to a holding cell awaiting formal charges. The church itself remained locked, its doors sealed with the authority of police procedure. Services were cancelled pending the resolution of the investigation. Those parishioners who had relied upon their weekly spiritual sustenance found themselves adrift, gathering instead in small clusters at the market and in drawing rooms, endlessly rehashing the circumstances of the arrest and speculating about the vicar's guilt or innocence. Mrs. Marple, however, occupied herself with a more practical concern. On Saturday morning, she composed a careful letter to Inspector Blackwell requesting a brief interview at his earliest convenience. She did not specify the nature of her inquiry, merely suggested that she had observations regarding the garden party that might merit his attention. The letter was delivered by hand through Constable Murdoch, who seemed somewhat bewildered by Mrs. Marple's insistence on the matter, but nonetheless conveyed her message to his superior officer. The inspector arrived at her cottage at 2:30 that same afternoon, his manner somewhat distracted, as though his mind were engaged with other aspects of the investigation. He accepted a cup of tea but declined the offered biscuits, settling into his chair with the air of a man whose time was being consumed by bureaucratic demands. "You wish to speak with me regarding additional observations, Mrs. Marple," he began without preamble. "Yes, Inspector. I've been reflecting upon the sequence of events at the garden party, and I find myself troubled by several aspects of the official conclusion regarding Reverend Sayers' guilt." The inspector's expression hardened slightly. "The evidence is quite straightforward. The cyanide was discovered in his study. He had access to the poison. He had motive. His marriage was clearly unhappy, and his wife was reportedly planning expenditures that would have strained his finances considerably. I do not dispute that the evidence appears to point in his direction, Mrs. Marple said carefully. However, I wonder if you have given sufficient consideration to the manner in which the poison was administered. You see, Inspector, I observed Mrs. Sayers' movements quite closely during the garden party, and I noticed something that seems to me rather significant. She paused to take a sip of her own tea, allowing the inspector time to settle into attentive silence. Mrs. Sayers was absent from the party for 23 minutes. During that time, she carried into the house one of the large silver tea urns. Now, the question that troubles me is this. Why would she personally carry an urn into the house when the refreshment tent was fully staffed and well supplied? It is the sort of task one would ordinarily delegate to a servant or volunteer. Perhaps she simply desired to fetch something from the house, the inspector suggested, though his tone indicated he recognized the weakness of the explanation. Perhaps. However, I took the liberty of speaking with Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard, the vicar's housekeeper, this morning. I inquired regarding the purpose of that urn, and she informed me something quite interesting. The urn had been taken to the house to be refilled with hot water. The refreshment tent had temporarily run short of hot water for additional tea, and Mrs. Sayers had taken the urn to the kitchen to remedy the situation. The inspector frowned. That hardly seems relevant to— It is relevant, Inspector, because it suggests that Mrs. Sayers was deliberately attending to her duties at the garden party, rather than avoiding it. A woman planning to poison herself would scarcely do so in the middle of her own event, and a woman who intended to be poisoned by her husband would hardly place herself in a position where she would be observed to be absent from the party for an extended period. The inspector set down his teacup with deliberate care. You are suggesting that Mrs. Sayers did not consume the poison at the garden party? I am suggesting, Inspector, that the timeline may be more complex than appears. Mrs. Sayers died sometime between the hours of 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon and the early morning hours of the following day. The garden party concluded at 5:30. Mrs. Sayers could have consumed the poison at any time during that extended window. The question is not merely when she was poisoned, but rather who had access to her during those hours and under what circumstances. The vicar had access to her all night, the inspector counted. They shared a bedroom. They did. However, the vicar's movements yesterday evening have been accounted for by multiple witnesses. He dined with the church wardens until 8 o'clock, returned to the vicarage at 8:20, and remained in his study reviewing parish accounts until nearly midnight. His housekeeper confirms that he did not retire until after he'd completed his paperwork. The inspector's jaw tightened. How do you know these details, Mrs. Marple? The investigation is not yet complete. Constable Murdoch mentioned them in passing when he conducted my interview, and various villagers have added details in the course of our conversations. Nothing you have told me is confidential, Inspector. It is all common knowledge by now. The inspector stood abruptly, his patience clearly exhausted. Mrs. Marple, while I appreciate your interest in the matter, I must remind you that police investigations require expertise and authority. The evidence against Reverend Sayers is substantial. The cyanide was found in his study. That is a fact that cannot be disputed. Indeed, it cannot, Mrs. Marple agreed quietly. However, Inspector, I wonder if you have asked yourself the crucial question, why would a man deliberately plant evidence of his crime in his own study? If Reverend Sayers had poisoned his wife, surely he would have disposed of the poison far more carefully. The discovery of that bottle seems to me to suggest not guilt, but rather the deliberate framing of an innocent man. The inspector paused in his movement toward the door, his hand resting on the mantelpiece. And who, in your estimation, would have reason to frame the vicar? That, Inspector, is the question I believe you should be asking. Someone with access to cyanide, certainly. Someone with knowledge of the vicar's unhappy marriage. And someone, most importantly, who had access to his study to place the evidence there. I suggest you consider whether anyone else in this village fits those criteria. The inspector departed without responding, but Mrs. Marple noticed that his expression had shifted from dismissive irritation to something more closely resembling thoughtful uncertainty. She settled back into her chair, her knitting needles resuming their steady rhythm, and allowed herself a small, private smile. The investigation, she suspected, was about to take a rather different direction entirely. Inspector Blackwell's departure from Mrs. Marple's cottage appeared to signal a subtle shift in the investigation's direction, though the village remained largely unaware of this change. The vicar remained in custody, and the formal charges were prepared for presentation before the magistrate on Monday morning. Yet those who paid close attention, and Mrs. Marple was nothing if not attentive, noticed that additional officers had begun conducting fresh interviews with those who had attended the garden party, and that certain lines of questioning had shifted from establishing motive for the vicar's guilt to exploring access and opportunity in a broader sense. On Sunday morning, Mrs. Marple attended church services at the small Methodist chapel on the village green, as she did most Sundays when services were available. The vicar's absence was acutely felt, the pulpit occupied by a visiting minister from the neighboring parish, who seemed acutely uncomfortable with the circumstances of his assignment. The congregation was smaller than usual, divided between those who had abandoned their faith in response to scandal and those who had come specifically to demonstrate their support for Reverend Sayers' innocence. Mrs. Marple sat quietly in her customary pew, observing the social geography of belief and doubt with her usual careful attention. It was after the service, as she stood in the chapel yard speaking with several other parishioners, that she observed something of considerable significance. Margaret Winters, the vicar's daughter, was speaking in low, urgent tones with James Corbett, the solicitor's clerk. Their conversation appeared tense, almost confrontational, and when Margaret noticed Mrs. Marple observing them, she flushed deeply and excused herself with evident haste. James, for his part, looked decidedly uncomfortable, adjusting his spectacles with nervous repetition and avoiding any direct eye contact with Mrs. Marple. That afternoon, Mrs. Marple paid a social call on her neighbor, Miss Honoria Finch, bringing with her a small basket of roses from her garden. As they sat in Miss Finch's parlor taking tea, Mrs. Marple gently steered the conversation toward the subject of Margaret Winters. "Such a lovely girl," Mrs. Marple observed, "though I confess I've noticed she seems somewhat distressed lately. The circumstances surrounding Mrs. Sayers' death must weigh heavily upon her, given her position as the vicar's daughter." Miss Finch, who could never resist an opportunity to discuss the affairs of others, readily engaged with the topic. "Oh yes, poor Margaret has taken it terribly hard. Though between you and me, Mrs. Marple, I've long suspected that her attachment to young Mr. Corbett was the source of considerable anxiety in the household." Mrs. Sayer, despite her outward respectability, held rather strict opinions regarding the suitability of matches. "James Corbett is the son of a tradesman, you know. His father owns a hardware business in Ashford Cross. For a vicar's daughter to form such an attachment was, in Mrs. Sayers' estimation, decidedly beneath her station." "How very unfortunate," Mrs. Marple said thoughtfully. "Do you suppose Mrs. Sayer made her disapproval known to Margaret?" "Oh, most certainly. My cousin Eleanor, she works as a maid at the vicarage, you understand, mentioned that there had been rather heated discussions between Margaret and her stepmother regarding Mr. Corbett. Mrs. Sayer had apparently suggested that Margaret was throwing away her prospects on an unsuitable match." Very harsh language, Eleanor said, quite unlike the outwardly gracious woman Mrs. Sayer presented to society. This information Mrs. Marple filed away with the precision of long practice. She now possessed a clear motive for Margaret Winters, protection of her romantic prospects and, perhaps more significantly, resistance to the domineering influence of her stepmother. But motive alone did not constitute guilt. The question of access and opportunity remained paramount. On Monday morning, as the magistrate prepared to hear the charges against Reverend Sayer, Mrs. Marple received an unexpected visitor. Inspector Blackwell arrived at her cottage with considerably more courtesy than he had demonstrated on his previous visit, and his manner suggested a man seeking counsel rather than dismissing it. "I've been reconsidering your observations regarding the planted evidence," he said without preamble, settling into the familiar armchair. "And I've begun to wonder whether you might assist me in clarifying a particular detail. You mentioned that someone would need access to the vicar's study to place the cyanide bottle there. I wonder if you have given thought to who, specifically, might have possessed such access without attracting undue attention." "Several people, I should imagine," Mrs. Marple replied carefully. "The vicar himself, naturally. His housekeeper, Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard, who would have routine reason to enter the study for cleaning purposes. The vicar's daughter, Margaret, who would presumably have reason to visit her father's study, and anyone else familiar enough with the household to enter without causing alarm. I have been questioning Mrs. Pritchard regarding her movements on the day of the garden party," the inspector continued. "She informs me that she did not enter the vicar's study that afternoon, as it was being prepared for the evening's church council meeting. However, she did mention something of interest. She stated that young Miss Margaret had requested the key to her father's study on Thursday morning, claiming she needed to retrieve a book her father had promised to lend her." Mrs. Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care. "And did she retrieve it?" "According to Mrs. Pritchard, Margaret entered the study for approximately 10 minutes and then returned the key. However, Mrs. Pritchard did not actually observe Margaret retrieving any book." The inspector paused, watching Mrs. Marple's face with the intensity of a man seeking confirmation of a developing theory. "I find myself wondering, Mrs. Marple, whether that 10-minute interval might have been sufficient time to place a bottle of cyanide in the study, particularly if one had previously arranged for it to be there." Mrs. Marple chose her words with meticulous care. "It would certainly be possible, Inspector. However, I wonder if you have considered a somewhat different interpretation of these events. What if Margaret did not place the cyanide, but rather discovered it? What if she entered the study and found evidence that someone had placed poison there?" The inspector leaned forward intently. "You believe she would protect whoever placed it?" "I believe, Inspector, that a young woman recently emotionally wounded by her stepmother might be susceptible to persuasion by someone she trusted. Someone, perhaps, who shared her resentment of Mrs. Sayers' influence. Someone who might convince her that the framing of her father was merely an unfortunate but necessary consequence of removing a woman who had caused considerable suffering." The inspector stood slowly, his expression grave. "I believe, Mrs. Marple, that you have just identified the true architect of this crime, and I suspect I know precisely who it is." Inspector Blackwell wasted no time in acting upon his new theory. Within the hour, he had dispatched Constable Murdoch to locate James Corbett and bring him to the police station for further questioning. The solicitor's clerk, who had spent the previous days maintaining a carefully constructed facade of innocent concern regarding the vicar's arrest, found his composure shattered when confronted with the inspector's direct accusations. Under the weight of mounting evidence and the inspector's methodical interrogation, James Corbett's carefully constructed story began to unravel like a poorly woven tapestry. The confession, when it came, emerged in fragments and half-truths, each admission dragged from him only after the inspector had presented contradictory evidence or witness statements. Yes, James had obtained the cyanide from a chemist acquaintance in London, a man who asked few questions about the purpose of such purchases. Yes, he had harbored deep resentment toward Mrs. Sayers for her opposition to his courtship of Margaret. Yes, he had placed the poison in the vicar's study on Thursday morning, intending for it to be discovered there as evidence of the vicar's guilt. But the critical detail, the one that transformed James Corbett from a man nursing grievances into an actual murderer, came only when Inspector Blackwell presented him with the results of his supplementary investigation. James had not merely obtained and planted the cyanide. He had, on Thursday afternoon, while the garden party continued, slipped into the vicarage through a side entrance that Margaret had unlocked for him. He had known that Dorothy would enter the house at approximately 4 o'clock to refill the tea urn, and he had prepared for her arrival with deliberate calculation. In the kitchen, James had laced the contents of a small dish of biscuits with cyanide. He had then positioned himself to observe Dorothy's movements, waiting for the moment when she would, as was her habit, sample the refreshments before returning to the garden party. The poison had acted swiftly, far more swiftly than James had anticipated. Dorothy had consumed a single biscuit, and within minutes she had begun to feel the first symptoms. She had retired to the upstairs wash basin, believing herself to be suffering from a sudden illness, only to collapse and die within a matter of minutes. James had then made his escape from the house, leaving Margaret, who had been waiting anxiously in the garden, to return to the party alone. By the time Dorothy's body was discovered the following morning, the crime had taken on a veneer of such complexity that suspicion had naturally fallen upon the vicar himself, particularly when the planted evidence had been discovered in his study exactly where James had positioned it. The confession was delivered to the magistrate on Monday afternoon, and by Tuesday morning the newspapers had begun their lurid coverage of what was being called the Poison Garden Party murder. Reverend Sayers was released from custody with profuse apologies from the police, though the damage to his reputation and spiritual authority had already been substantially accomplished. His position in Little Thornwick became untenable almost immediately. Within a fortnight, he had submitted his resignation to the bishop and made arrangements to relocate to a small parish in Cornwall, where he hoped to begin rebuilding his life away from the scrutiny of a village that had, however briefly, believed him capable of murdering his wife. Margaret Winters faced a more complex reckoning. Her role in the conspiracy, limited though it was, became the subject of intense village scrutiny and moral judgment. She had not administered the poison, but she had actively assisted in the murder's concealment by unlocking the side entrance to the vicarage and failing to report her knowledge of James's presence in the house. The magistrate, taking into account her youth and the considerable emotional pressure she had been subjected to by both her stepmother and her lover, recommended a lenient sentence. She served 8 months in prison before being released into the custody of a sympathetic aunt in Yorkshire, where she eventually rebuilt her life in relative obscurity. James Corbett, however, faced the full weight of the law. He was tried for murder at the assizes in the county town, convicted on the strength of both his confession and the scientific evidence that confirmed cyanide poisoning as the cause of death. He was sentenced to death by hanging, a sentence that was carried out on a grey November morning in 1937, slightly more than 5 months after Dorothy Sayers had consumed the poisoned biscuit in her husband's kitchen. Mrs. Marple learned of the execution through the newspaper, a brief notice tucked between the weather report and an advertisement for ladies' footwear. She read the account with her customary equanimity, then folded the newspaper carefully and set it aside. She did not attend any of the subsequent gatherings where the village discussed the case, did not participate in the endless rehashing of motives and psychology that occupied so much of Little Thornwick's social discourse. Instead, she sat in her garden on a quiet afternoon in late November, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm, and contemplated the dark complexity of human nature. A young man, wounded by rejection and twisted by resentment, had committed murder. A young woman, susceptible to emotional manipulation and desperate to protect her romantic prospects, had become complicit in that murder. And an older woman, whose only crime had been to maintain standards that society itself had established, had paid with her life. There was no satisfaction in the resolution, no sense of justice served. There was merely the confirmation of what Mrs. Marple had known for more than 70 years, that evil lived not in distant places or among the obviously wicked, but within the ordinary hearts of ordinary people, waiting for the right combination of circumstances and grievance to express itself in violence. She picked up her knitting and returned to her cottage as the light began to fade, leaving the garden to the approaching darkness. The winter of 1936 descended upon Little Thornwick with unusual severity, bringing with it a gradual restoration of the village's equilibrium. The immediate shock of Dorothy Sayers' murder and the revelation of James Corbett's guilt had begun to fade into the more comfortable realm of historical scandal. Something that had happened, certainly, but something that could now be discussed with the comfortable distance that time and repetition provided. The village gossips found new subjects to occupy their attention. The prospects of the new vicar, recently appointed from a parish in Sussex, the surprising engagement of young Henrietta Ashford to a doctor from Harley Street, the steady decline of Lord Ashford's health. Yet for Mrs. Marple, the case did not fully resolve itself into the neat conclusion that the courts and newspapers had presented. She found herself returning with increasing frequency to certain details that nagged at the edges of her consciousness like a persistent itch that one cannot quite reach to scratch. It was not that she doubted James Corbett's guilt. The confession, the evidence, the clear motive all pointed to his culpability with unavoidable clarity. Rather, it was a peculiar inconsistency in the timeline that had struck her as she reviewed, mentally, the sequence of events surrounding Dorothy's death. In early December, when the village had largely moved on to other concerns, Mrs. Marple received an unexpected letter from Inspector Blackwell. It was delivered by post, a formal envelope bearing the insignia of the Ashford Cross Police Station, and it contained a request that surprised her considerably. The inspector wondered if Mrs. Marple might be willing to review certain aspects of the case file, as he had begun to entertain a private doubt regarding a particular element of James Corbett's confession. They met in the vicarage study, now occupied by the new vicar, a younger man of more liberal temperament who seemed relieved to assist in the clarification of historical detail. The inspector spread before Mrs. Marple a collection of documents, witness statements, autopsy reports, photographs of the crime scene, and the detailed notes he had taken throughout his investigation. "There is something that troubles me," the inspector began, his usual brusque manner softened by evident intellectual uncertainty. "James Corbett confessed to preparing the poisoned biscuits in the kitchen on Thursday afternoon. However, the cook, the vicar's cook, not Mrs. Pritchard, but a woman named Mrs. Adelaide Hawkins, was present in the kitchen during the entire period of the garden party. She has been quite firm in her statement that she observed no one preparing any biscuits, poisoned or otherwise." Mrs. Marple examined the cook's statement carefully. Mrs. Adelaide Hawkins had been employed in the vicarage for 12 years, predating Dorothy Sayers' arrival by several years. She was described in the margins of the inspector's notes as reliable and observant, though somewhat defensive regarding her kitchen authority. "Did James Corbett explain how he managed to prepare the biscuits without being observed?" Mrs. Marple asked. "He claimed that Mrs. Hawkins had briefly stepped outside to dispose of refuse, and that he had accomplished the task during her absence. However, Mrs. Hawkins is adamant that she never left the kitchen during the relevant period. She states that she prepared a cold luncheon for the servants' quarters and remained at her workstation throughout the afternoon." Mrs. Marple set the statement aside and picked up another document, the detailed timeline of events that had been constructed during the investigation. "Tell me, Inspector, has anyone verified precisely when Dorothy consumed the poison? The autopsy established the approximate time of death, but surely the actual consumption might have occurred somewhat earlier." "The doctor estimated that death occurred between 3 and 5 hours after consumption," the inspector replied. "Given that the body was discovered at approximately 7 o'clock in the morning, that would place consumption somewhere between 2 and 4 o'clock the previous afternoon." "And the garden party began at 2 o'clock precisely?" "Yes. Dorothy herself arrived at 1:30 to conduct final preparations." Mrs. Marple rose from her chair and began to pace slowly about the study, her mind visibly engaged in the process of recalibration. "Inspector, I wonder if you have considered the possibility that the poisoned biscuits were not prepared on Thursday afternoon at all, but rather on Thursday morning, or perhaps even earlier than that." The inspector's eyes narrowed. But how could James Corbett have managed such a thing without access to the vicarage? He could not have, Mrs. Marple said quietly. Which raises the question, who else possessed both access and the necessary knowledge of Dorothy's habits to accomplish the crime? She paused beside the desk, her aged hands resting lightly upon its surface. Tell me, Inspector, has Mrs. Adelaide Hawkins been in service in this house since before Dorothy Sayers' arrival? Yes, she arrived approximately 14 months after Mrs. Sayer. And did she, by any chance, previously serve in this capacity elsewhere in the village? The inspector consulted his notes. She worked as a cook for Lord Ashford's household for nearly 20 years before coming to the vicarage. She left Lord Ashford's employ rather abruptly when Mrs. Sayer came to Little Thornwick. Mrs. Marple returned to her chair, her expression grave. I believe, Inspector, that you have made a significant error in your investigation. Not in establishing that James Corbett possessed motive and opportunity. He clearly did both, but perhaps in your assumption regarding who actually administered the poison. The inspector leaned forward intently. You believe Mrs. Hawkins poisoned Dorothy Sayer? I believe it is possible, Mrs. Marple said carefully. Consider, Mrs. Hawkins had worked for Lord Ashford for nearly 2 decades. Mrs. Sayer arrived in Little Thornwick 5 years ago and very quickly became the dominant social figure in the village, overshadowing Mrs. Ashford and effectively reducing Lord Ashford's wife to a secondary position in local society. If Mrs. Hawkins harbored loyalty to the Ashford household, which a 20-year tenure would suggest, she might well have harbored resentment toward the woman who had so thoroughly eclipsed her former employer's wife. But what of James Corbett's confession? The inspector protested. What indeed? Mrs. Marple replied. A confession obtained under intense interrogation, made by a young man already guilty of being an accomplice to murder, faced with the prospect of a long prison sentence. How difficult might it have been to convince him that he had committed an act he had not, in fact, performed? Particularly if someone more knowledgeable, someone with access to the vicarage, someone with motive, suggested to him that his acceptance of responsibility would protect a young woman he loved. The inspector sat back slowly, his expression troubled. If you are correct, Mrs. Marple, then we have hanged an innocent man for a crime that was, in fact, committed by someone else. Not entirely innocent, Mrs. Marple corrected gently. He did assist in the concealment of the crime and in the framing of the vicar, but guilty of murder itself? I fear that conclusion may indeed be an error. The revelation that Mrs. Adelaide Hawkins might be the true architect of Dorothy Sayers' murder created a crisis of considerable magnitude within the police force and the legal establishment. Inspector Blackwell's preliminary reinvestigation uncovered details that had been overlooked or undervalued during the initial investigation. Mrs. Hawkins had indeed worked for the Ashford household for 2 decades. She had left that position almost immediately upon Dorothy Sayers' arrival in the village. And most crucially, she had access to numerous household chemicals and compounds that might have included or facilitated the acquisition of cyanide. Yet there remained a fundamental problem. James Corbett had confessed to the crime, had been tried and convicted, and had been executed. The legal machinery, once set in motion, could not be easily reversed. While a posthumous pardon was theoretically possible, it required irrefutable proof of innocence and admission of judicial error, a threshold that the available evidence, while suggestive, had not yet definitively crossed. Mrs. Marple found herself the reluctant center of a small but intense investigation conducted by Inspector Blackwell and a solicitor brought in from London to advise on the legal implications of the potential miscarriage of justice. She was questioned extensively regarding her reasoning, her observations, and the logical chains that had led her to suspect Mrs. Hawkins rather than accepting the official conclusion of James Corbett's guilt. It was during one of these sessions, conducted in the vicarage study on a cold December afternoon, that Mrs. Marple made an observation that would ultimately prove decisive. "You must understand, Inspector," she said, her aged hands folded carefully in her lap, "that I have spent a lifetime observing the habits and behaviors of those around me. In that time, I've learned that human beings are creatures of extraordinary consistency. We perform our daily routines with almost mechanical precision unless something fundamentally disrupts our patterns." "And what pattern did you observe in Mrs. Hawkins?" the inspector asked. "Mrs. Hawkins has been in service for nearly 40 years, Mrs. Marple continued. "In such a career, one develops certain habits regarding the preparation of food. One develops rituals, preferred methods, established ways of conducting one's work. When I examined the account of the poisoned biscuits, the manner in which they were prepared, the specific configuration in which they were arranged, I recognized certain characteristics that seemed to me distinctly inconsistent with James Corbett's probable methods." "You are suggesting that the style of preparation itself might indicate the true perpetrator?" "I'm suggesting, Inspector, that whoever poisoned those biscuits possessed considerable culinary skill and familiarity with household management. James Corbett, by all accounts, is a solicitor's clerk with no training in cookery. Mrs. Adelaide Hawkins, however, is a trained cook with nearly 40 years of professional experience. The biscuits were poisoned in a manner that required both precision and knowledge, characteristics far more consistent with the work of someone with her expertise." The inspector leaned back in his chair, frustration evident in his expression. "But without a confession or concrete physical evidence, we cannot proceed. Mrs. Hawkins denies any involvement in the crime. She claims she was in her kitchen throughout the afternoon of the garden party. Her account is supported by Mrs. Pritchard, the housekeeper, who confirms that Mrs. Hawkins was present when the cook sent up the tea service for the servants' quarters." "Then perhaps we must encourage Mrs. Hawkins to reconsider her account," Mrs. Marple suggested quietly. "Not through interrogation or accusation, but through a more subtle form of persuasion." The inspector regarded her with evident suspicion. "What precisely do you propose, Mrs. Marple?" "I propose that you allow me to conduct a conversation with Mrs. Hawkins, not as a representative of the police or the law, but simply as an elderly woman engaged in private discourse. I believe she may be susceptible to a certain form of psychological pressure if it is applied correctly." The inspector hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the suggestion. Yet he recognized, as Mrs. Marple did, that conventional investigation had reached an impasse. After considerable deliberation and consultation with the solicitor from London, permission was granted for Mrs. Marple to conduct an informal interview with Mrs. Hawkins under circumstances that would not suggest official investigation. The conversation took place on a grey afternoon in mid-December, in Mrs. Hawkins's small sitting room adjacent to the kitchen. Mrs. Marple had arranged the meeting by telephoning the vicar's housekeeper and inquiring whether Mrs. Hawkins might be willing to provide advice regarding the preparation of a particular custard tart. It was the sort of request that Mrs. Hawkins, proud of her professional reputation, could not easily refuse. Once they were settled with tea and biscuits, a detail that Mrs. Marple found darkly ironic, she began to speak, not of the crime or the investigation, but of life in service, of the relationships that developed between employer and employee, of the particular loyalties and resentments that could emerge over decades of employment. "You served the Ashford household for a very long time," Mrs. Marple observed conversationally. "That must have created a certain attachment to the family." Mrs. Hawkins stiffened slightly. "It was respectable employment. Mrs. Ashford was always fair in her dealings with me." "And yet you left rather suddenly when Mrs. Sayers arrived in the village," Mrs. Marple continued. "I wonder if that departure was entirely voluntary, or if perhaps circumstances made it difficult to remain in the Ashford household." "I preferred a change of situation," Mrs. Hawkins replied, but there was a tightness in her voice that suggested otherwise. "Of course. Though it must have been painful to observe the way Mrs. Sayers so quickly displaced Mrs. Ashford in the social hierarchy of the village. Mrs. Ashford, who had been the unquestioned center of village society for so many years, suddenly reduced to a secondary position by a woman of limited local connection and questionable antecedents." Mrs. Hawkins set down her teacup with a sharp clink. I don't see what that has to do with me, Mrs. Marple. Perhaps nothing, Mrs. Marple acknowledged gently. And yet I have often observed that loyalty to one's former employer can be a powerful motivator. A cook who had served faithfully for 20 years might very well develop strong feelings regarding the treatment of that employer's family. Mrs. Hawkins's face had gone pale, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the arms of her chair. Mrs. Marple watched her carefully, noting each small sign of emotional distress with the precision of long practice. "I wonder," Mrs. Marple said softly, "if you have ever considered what it might mean, the fact that an innocent young man was hanged for a crime he did not commit. A young man whose only real guilt was in loving unwisely and acting foolishly. A young man who may have accepted responsibility for something he did not do in order to protect someone he cared for." Mrs. Hawkins stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound. "I think you should leave now, Mrs. Marple. This conversation is at an end." But Mrs. Marple remained seated, her aged eyes steady and compassionate. "I'm not here as an agent of the law, Mrs. Hawkins. I'm simply an old woman who understands that sometimes terrible things occur for reasons that are themselves comprehensible, even if not excusable. And I believe that you are a woman of conscience, buried though that conscience may be beneath layers of justification and rationalization." In the silence that followed, Mrs. Hawkins sank back into her chair, and tears began to stream down her weathered face. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "She destroyed everything," Mrs. Hawkins said. "Everything that Mrs. Ashford had built, everything she had been. And no one seemed to care. No one seemed to notice that a good woman was being humiliated by a social climber with no regard for anything but her own advancement. I thought if I removed her, if I removed the source of that humiliation, things would return to normal. I thought Mrs. Ashford would regain her position. I thought it would be justice." The confession, when recorded properly by Inspector Blackwell and witnessed by the solicitor from London, provided the irrefutable proof of James Corbett's innocence that the legal system required. The legal machinery that had moved with such inexorable speed in condemning James Corbett ground forward with considerably greater reluctance in acknowledging its error. Months of procedural wrangling followed Mrs. Hawkins's confession. Solicitors consulted with barristers. The Home Office was petitioned. Inquiries were launched into how the initial investigation had failed to properly examine Mrs. Hawkins's movements and motivations. The press, which had so eagerly reported James Corbett's conviction and execution, now began to shift its narrative toward the more compelling story of judicial injustice and the dangers of hasty conclusions. Mrs. Adelaide Hawkins was tried for murder in the spring of 1937, more than a year after Dorothy Sayers' death. The trial attracted considerable attention, though the fascination stemmed less from any doubt regarding her guilt. Her confession was unequivocal, than from the broader implications of the case regarding the reliability of police investigation and judicial procedure. The evidence presented at trial painted a picture of methodical planning and deliberate execution. Mrs. Hawkins had obtained the cyanide through contacts developed during her earlier years in service, long before she came to the vicarage. She had prepared the poisoned biscuits on Thursday morning, concealing them in a sealed tin that she kept in her private quarters. When Dorothy had entered the kitchen that afternoon to refill the tea urn, Mrs. Hawkins had simply offered her one of the biscuits, claiming she had baked them fresh that morning as a special treat for the refreshment tent. Dorothy, unsuspecting and trusting in the goodwill of the household staff, had consumed the biscuit without hesitation. The poison had acted with swift precision, and Dorothy had retired to the upstairs wash basin, believing herself to be suffering from a sudden acute illness. She had died there, alone and confused, within minutes of consuming the fatal dose. The trial lasted 4 days. The prosecution presented its case with methodical clarity. The defense offered little resistance, acknowledging Mrs. Hawkins's guilt while attempting to establish mitigating circumstances based on her allegedly obsessive loyalty to the Ashford household and her inability to accept the social displacement of her former mistress. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a verdict of guilty. The judge sentenced Mrs. Hawkins to death by hanging, a sentence that would be carried out in the autumn of 1937. Yet it was the fate of James Corbett that occupied the greater portion of the public and legal consciousness. The Home Office issued a formal declaration of his posthumous innocence, acknowledging that he had been executed for a crime he had not committed. A modest financial compensation was offered to his parents, though no amount of money could restore the years of his life or ameliorate the injustice of his death. His conviction was formally overturned, his name cleared in the legal record, his memory rehabilitated in the eyes of the law, if not entirely in the eyes of the village that had so readily believed him guilty. Inspector Blackwell, who had conducted the initial investigation with such apparent confidence, submitted his resignation from the police force. He was offered the opportunity to remain in his position following a review of his conduct, but he chose instead to retire, citing age and ill health. In private conversations, however, he made clear to Mrs. Marple that he had decided to step aside as a form of accountability for his failure to perceive the truth that should have been obvious to a more careful observer. "I allowed my reasoning to become narrow," he confessed during a final visit to Mrs. Marple's cottage in June of 1937. "I fixed upon James Corbett as the guilty party, and then arranged the evidence to support that conclusion, rather than following the evidence to its natural conclusion. You were correct when you suggested that the style and method of the poisoning itself indicated someone with considerable culinary expertise. I should have recognized that immediately." Mrs. Marple, who had settled into her usual chair with her knitting despite the warmth of the summer afternoon, regarded him with compassion. "You performed your duty as you understood it, Inspector, and in the end, the truth emerged, though not through the conventional channels of investigation. Sometimes the most important revelations come not from official inquiry, but from the careful observation of human nature and the willingness to question one's own assumptions." "Will you ever write an account of this case?" the inspector asked. "Your insights were remarkable. Others might benefit from understanding your methods of reasoning." Mrs. Marple smiled faintly. "I am merely an old woman who has lived a long time and observed much. I possess no special gift for detection, only a lifetime of experience with the patterns of human behavior. If I were to commit my observations to paper, I fear they would appear merely eccentric, the musings of a woman with too much time on her hands and an overactive imagination." "On the contrary," the inspector replied, "your observations were precisely calibrated and rigorously logical. You saw what others did not because you looked more carefully and questioned your own conclusions more thoroughly. That is not eccentricity, that is the very essence of rigorous thinking." After the inspector's departure, Mrs. Marple sat alone in her parlor as the evening light began its slow descent toward darkness. She thought of James Corbett, dead now for more than a year, hanged for a crime committed by a woman driven by misguided loyalty and class resentment. She thought of Mrs. Hawkins, who would herself face execution before the year was complete, a woman whose devotion to her former employer had transformed her into a murderer. She thought of the vicar, whose reputation had been tattered by false accusation, and of Margaret Winters, whose youthful indiscretion had placed her in the path of manipulation and complicity. And she thought, as she had thought many times over the preceding months, about the extraordinary ordinariness of evil, how it emerged not from grand motives or elaborate schemes, but from small resentments nurtured and nursed into monstrous proportions, how it infected communities not through obvious villainy, but through the subtle corruption of loyalty and the transformation of love into possessiveness. Mrs. Marple picked up her knitting and returned to the small cardigan she had been working on since the previous spring. The stitches were even, the pattern methodical and precise. In the careful repetition of the work, There was something almost meditative, something that allowed her mind to process the complexities of human nature without the burden of judgment. The mystery of the Quiet Wash Basin had been solved, but Mrs. Marple understood that the deeper mystery, the mystery of why ordinary people committed extraordinary acts of violence, would remain eternally unsolved. It was enough, she reflected, simply to observe, to question, and to recognize that truth, however difficult to uncover, was always worth pursuing. The autumn of 1937 descended upon Little Thornwick with the peculiar quality of seasonal change that seems to wash away the accumulated sorrows of preceding months. The leaves turned gold, and crimson the harvest was gathered, and the village settled into the rhythms of approaching winter. Yet beneath this surface normality, a subtle transformation had occurred. The bonds of community trust that had once seemed immutable had been fractured and, though carefully repaired, bore the visible scars of that fracture. Mrs. Adelaide Hawkins was executed on a cold November morning, her death marking the final chapter in the legal consequences of Dorothy Sayers' murder. The event passed with considerably less public fanfare than James Corbett's execution had generated. There was a quality of anticlimax to it, as though the village had exhausted its capacity for moral indignation and was now merely going through the motions of concluding a tragedy that had already claimed far more than justice would seem to require. The new vicar, Reverend Harold Pemberton, had established himself as a capable and sympathetic administrator of the parish. He was younger than his predecessor, less inclined toward the rigid propriety that had characterized Reverend Sayers' tenure, and he made a deliberate effort to rebuild the damaged reputation of the church and vicarage. Within 6 months of his arrival, Sunday attendance had begun to recover, though certain members of the congregation, particularly those who had been most vocal in their condemnation of the vicar during the investigation, seemed to experience a persistent discomfort when attending services. It was on a quiet afternoon in December, nearly 18 months after Dorothy Sayers' death, that Mrs. Marple received a visitor she had not expected. Margaret Winters, released from prison and returned to Little Thornwick after several years abroad with her aunt in Yorkshire, appeared at the cottage door with evident hesitation, as though uncertain of her welcome. Mrs. Marple received her in the parlor, noting with careful observation the changes that imprisonment and exile had wrought upon the young woman. Margaret was thinner, more reserved, and her eyes carried a quality of hard-won understanding that comes only through suffering and reflection. "I wanted to speak with you before I leave Little Thornwick permanently," Margaret said, settling into the offered chair with the formal courtesy of someone acutely aware of her social vulnerability. "I owe you a considerable debt, though I suspect you may not view the matter in that light." "You owe me nothing, my dear," Mrs. Marple replied gently. "You were a young woman caught in circumstances largely beyond your control, manipulated by someone who understood your vulnerabilities and exploited them ruthlessly." "And yet I was complicit," Margaret insisted. "I unlocked the door. I allowed James to enter the house. I did not report what I suspected regarding his intentions. Whatever circumstances contributed to my actions, I cannot escape responsibility for them." Mrs. Marple set down her teacup and regarded Margaret with the full attention of her considerable perceptiveness. "You have learned an important lesson, my dear, one that many people never grasp. The understanding that our actions have consequences extends far beyond our immediate intentions. You acted from love and fear, yet those emotions led you to participate in murder. That is a difficult knowledge to carry, and I suspect you have carried it with considerable burden." "Every day," Margaret confirmed quietly. "Every single day I have thought of Mrs. Sayer, and of James, and of my father. I have thought about what might have happened if I had simply refused to assist James, if I had reported my suspicions to someone in authority. James might still be alive. My father's reputation might not have been destroyed. Mrs. Sayer would still be here, however much I resented her." "And yet," Mrs. Marple observed, "you cannot alter the past, only how you live in consequence of it. Where do you intend to go when you leave Little Thornwick? I have secured a position as a companion to an elderly woman in Bath, Margaret explained. It is quiet work, undemanding, the sort of position that does not require extensive social engagement or references that would expose my history. I shall attempt to build a life of modest usefulness, and perhaps, over time, I shall come to terms with what has occurred. After Margaret's departure, Mrs. Marple sat alone in her parlour as the winter light faded into premature darkness. She thought about the nature of consequence and redemption, about the possibility of forgiveness, both of others and of oneself. She thought about James Corbett, whose youth and vulnerability had made him susceptible to manipulation by someone he loved. She thought about Mrs. Hawkins, whose loyalty had calcified into obsession and ultimately into murderous action. She thought about Reverend Sayer, whose marriage had been destroyed by forces beyond his control, and about Dorothy, whose only real crime had been to possess social ambition and the capability to achieve it. The mystery of the Quiet Wash Basin had been solved with complete logical clarity. Yet Mrs. Marple understood that some mysteries, the deeper ones that concerned the human capacity for cruelty masquerading as virtue, for violence emerging from distorted love, these mysteries could never be fully resolved. They could only be observed, understood in their particulars, and mourned for their inevitability. By Christmas of 1937, Little Thornwick had largely returned to its customary state of orderly village life. The scandal had become historical rather than immediate. New gossip had begun to circulate regarding other matters of local concern. The permanent residents of the village went about their lives, maintaining the careful social fictions that allowed community to function despite the knowledge of human nature's darker possibilities. Yet Mrs. Marple continued, as she had always done, to observe. She sat in her garden when weather permitted, worked at her knitting during the grey winter months, attended church services and village functions. She listened to gossip with patient attention, noticed small deviations in behavior, recognized the signs of hidden resentment and concealed passion that ordinary observation would miss. For she had learned, over a lifetime of careful watching, that evil did not announce itself through dramatic gestures or obvious villainy. It emerged quietly in small moments of moral compromise, in the gradual transformation of reasonable conviction into obsessive certainty, in the slow erosion of ethical boundaries until actions that would have once seemed unthinkable became inevitable. The Quiet Wash Basin had been merely one instance of this universal human truth. Dorothy Sayers had died there, poisoned by someone motivated by misguided loyalty and resentment at a social displacement. But the real tragedy had not been her death, tragic though that was, but rather the revelation of how easily ordinary people could be transformed into instruments of violence by circumstances and emotions that festered beneath the surface of respectable village life. Mrs. Marple understood that there would be other mysteries, other crimes, other occasions when human nature would reveal its capacity for darkness. She had no special gift for prevention or intervention. She possessed only the patient observation of a lifetime and the willingness to see, in the patterns of human behavior, the signs of trouble before they expressed themselves in violence. As the new year of 1938 approached, Mrs. Marple continued with her quiet life, her knitting needles clicking with their familiar rhythm, her observations accumulating like the careful stitches of an intricate tapestry. She remained alert to the small irregularities that suggested hidden depths, the subtle behaviors that indicated concealed motivations, the quiet moments when human nature revealed itself in all its complex contradictions. The village did not know that it was being observed so carefully, that its secrets and small dramas were being catalogued and analyzed by an elderly woman whose apparent gentleness concealed a formidable intellect. But Mrs. Marple did not require recognition or acknowledgement. She was content simply to watch, to understand, and to recognize that in the careful observation of human nature, lay the only reliable path to truth. The mystery of the Quiet Wash Basin had been solved. But the larger mystery, the eternal puzzle of how ordinary people in ordinary places could commit extraordinary acts of violence, that mystery remained, as it always would, the subject of Mrs. Marple's patient, unending contemplation. And so little Thornwick returned to peace, though a peace shadowed by knowledge that could never again be fully suppressed. Mrs. Marple, seated in her garden on a quiet afternoon in late December, watched the winter light fade toward evening, and reflected, as she had reflected many times before, on the strange and terrible beauty of human nature in all its manifestations. The kettle began to whistle in the kitchen. Mrs. Marple gathered her knitting and rose to prepare tea, moving through her cottage with the practiced efficiency of someone who had lived 70 years in the rhythms of ordinary domestic life. She poured hot water over the tea leaves, settled herself in her favorite chair by the window, and picked up her needles once more. Outside, the wind moved through the bare branches of the English winter. Inside, the needles clicked with their ancient, patient rhythm, creating order and beauty from simple strands of wool. And in that quiet moment, as evening descended over Little Thornwick, Mrs. Marple reflected that this simple, repetitive, ordinary work was perhaps the closest one could come to understanding the fundamental mysteries of existence. The Quiet Wash Basin had claimed its victim. Justice had been served, though imperfectly and at considerable cost. And life, as it always did, continued on, carrying with it the accumulated weight of human tragedy and the persistent hope that somehow, in the careful observation of detail and the rigorous application of logic, truth might be found. Mrs. Marple took a sip of her tea and returned to her knitting, content in the knowledge that she had done what she could, understood what she could, and accepted what could not be changed. And in that acceptance lay a kind of peace, not the peace of ignorance, but the harder, more durable peace that comes from seeing clearly and accepting what one sees with equanimity. The mystery was solved. The criminal had been identified and would face justice. The innocent had been exonerated, though that exoneration could not restore what had been taken from them. And Mrs. Marple, having played her small role in the unfolding of these events, returned to her quiet life, waiting patiently for whatever mysteries the future might hold.